Hello, good evening. Tonight we have Farshid Moussavi with us. As you know, Farshid is an architect, co-founder of Foreign Office Architects, FOA, and professor in practice of architecture at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. She was educated at Harvard GSD, University of College of London, and Dundee University. She has been teaching in many places in the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna and IAAC and different places. And as an architect, she did with Alejandro, his former partner, one of the most important buildings of our generation, that is the Yokohama Port Terminal. She's involved right now in many different projects, and we are very happy that she is today with us. Thank you for coming.
I'm just going to stay. I'll stay here. It's fine. I'll stay here. I'll stay here. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Well, thank you to friends and others that I don't know for being here. I called the lecture Form and Ornament, and I was mentioning earlier that I was bored of my lecture. So I decided to add the more recent research that I've started at Harvard with students, which is on style. And so I am going to talk to them about them in reverse. So style, then form, and then ornament. So I'll be trying to connect the three, and then showing a couple of projects really to illustrate. So as a kind of a general summary of what is about to come, the argument is that architects, if architects are to use the concept of style productively, we need to take style away from discussions of representing a region or representing a period in history or representing an author. And we have to talk about style in relationship to innovation. And so the question is, you know, what do we innovate? How do we innovate? What is the instrument of architectural innovation? In this sense, perhaps we could also touch upon one common word between the three research, which is function. I think underpinning the inquiry in all of these is also questioning the relationship between form and function, and questioning especially the way the relationship between form and function was defined up until, let's say, mid-20th century. Form and function were understood as being isomorphic with each other, and generally speaking, mostly form was to follow function. And of course, function was understood to do with anything with matter, say the physical world, the empirical technology, and form would embrace the other side, which would be anything to do with the consciousness, mind, and fantasy. So the generic city that Rem Koolhaas has coined, that we arrived to in the 20th century, arose from this relationship of form and function, which was defined very much by this senselessness, by anonymity, by idealism, by uniformity and simple repetition. So forms were trapped in these ideal definitions of function, and therefore architects could only engender one kind of form from one kind of function. Now, during this same period, of course, there were the avant-garde that tried to challenge this uniformity with different kinds of visions, mainly to bring in political and social visions to what would be otherwise purely functional. and to promote their visions, each one of them adopt a position of critical distance from this reality that they were seeing expand in front of them, reality of this expanding mechanized city. So different avant-garde movements adopted different techniques to produce this critical distance from this reality. In art, for example, here, Dadaism used montage and radical juxtaposition of forms to challenge the kind of social and spatial segregations that were being witnessed. Surrealism used psychic autonomism or dream analysis as a way to liberate the unconscious or the imagination. Situationists use the construction of situations or psychogeography to subvert the degradation of life that was emerging. On the capitalism in architecture, it was of course the Russian avant-garde that used machine aesthetic as a way to promote a new utopian order and to kind of celebrate the, if you like, the functional aspects and also social aspects of machines. However, in all of these new visions were somehow, or the innovations that they were planning to deliver through these new techniques were very much trapped, one could say, or they were depending on this dialectical relationship between form and function, and therefore they were also trapped by this origin that they had to depend on in order to situate themselves, and by depending on it, they couldn't really move beyond it. So ever since the latter part of the 20th century, we have been witnessing a new relationship between form and function that is no longer isomorphic. A new generic city has been emerging, and a new kind of, therefore, urbanism. Whether it is located in the Middle East, Asia, or the Far East, this new generic city is the product of a more prudent kind of urbanism characterized by the excitement of its architecture. With each of its districts seemed to appeal to a particular kind of individual, whether you are facing airports or museums, shopping centers, social housing, or office towers. They are all equally exciting and spectacular, often resulting in this kind of array of divergent styles, which also apparently has quite a lot of similarity between projects, whether they are emerging out of public or private or even public partnerships. So this new urban condition raises many questions. Is there a common ground or foundation to all these divergent design experimentations? Are there any social or political ambitions or implications underlying this diversity? What about architects' freedom from the market, or a critique of the economic forces that drive it? How is it possible that commercial and cultural projects look alike? Have publicly funded projects lost their political vision? Can a city, which is composed of different styled buildings standing alongside one another, be considered good taste? So this last decade, 10 or 15 years, raises all these questions, and it has raised a lot of anxiety, mainly actually amongst architects. I'm not sure if the public are as dubious about this last 10 or 15 years, but for sure it seems there are a lot of architects who are actually excited that the recession will take us back to basics and away from this incredible degree of experimentation. Well, I think it's important to look back at this period and say, what did we learn, even if some of it was not good. For sure, if we look, and I'm not really going to show the style research tonight, but just drop in some of the premises behind it, that they are behind these divergent experimentations. There is actually a new type of relationship between form and function. It is for sure that during this same period we've had new technologies to design, to fabricate, to assemble built forms, and they have this new means has allowed us to look at, obviously, a broader set of geometries, ways to assemble forms, and therefore explore different sensations to them. And so there is no longer one image to every function, and there is no longer a single image attached to our tools or machines or the technologies we use, but many. I mean, I think this space is very much an example of that. So I believe that if you look closely at this range of projects, of experimentations, you see a new relationship between form and function that is anisomorphic. The two are related, but they follow slightly divergent paths. And if you look closely and group these projects typologically, you see that actually the great projects find similar trajectories, and that they show that architects use forms in much more careful way than we give them credit for. So you see that in office typologies, we see twisting of forms, we see stepping, we see bending, we see roundness. So these are explorations done with office buildings that are not done necessarily, for example, with residential towers. We find perforations in residential buildings. We find banding in residential buildings. We find color in residential buildings, much more than in offices or non in offices. We find openness pursued in educational buildings. We find patterning in retail complexes. We find pillowing in airports, etc., etc. So I think when you look at projects that are pursuing a kind of a form-function dialogue, you find that those projects actually have something in common. And if you study them further, you see that architects are actually trying to innovate typologically, functionally, through formal investigations. Now, obviously, this is in parallel with the new world that we find ourselves in the new century, one where it is difficult now to find a single political position or a foundation to challenge and base life on. We live in a world that is much more molecular. It presents architects with lots of different problems of different scales, and these problems are rooted in multiple spheres. In order to act upon these problems, one has to deal with functional issues, and therefore it's impossible to address these problems architecturally through the position of critical distance, and therefore perhaps if we look at the projects of the last 10 or 15 years, we see that they are adopting a completely different position, one where they are exploring embeddedness in the environment. They are trying to become imperceptible with the market. They're trying to immerse themselves in the specific forces that shape each one of the projects, finding lines of flight, finding trajectories in which they could innovate and almost subvert the way things happen conventionally. So I think we've arrived to a different situation where the new generic city is no longer banal. It thrives on novelty, and of course novelty is very much about innovation. Novelty is also about taking something that exists and changing it, transforming things almost in a kind of an evolutionary process. It's not about being more advanced, it's not about being better evolved, it's simply about being different. Now, this is BD is a architectural weekly paper in the UK. I found, at the time when I was putting these slides together, this interesting coincidence where you see a project of FOA here and a project of David Adjaye here. They are both educational buildings, and one is in London, the other one in Moscow, and there is a considerable amount of similarity between these two projects. They are both trying to play with how you tile the external envelope of these educational buildings, and they even use virtually the same color. I haven't really studied what came first, and frankly, I don't think it matters. What is relevant in the context of discussion tonight is that if you look at them, they're actually quite different, and I'm interested in those differences. We can look at Ravensbourne perhaps later on. Now, I think these projects, in a way, allow us to look at innovation at another scale, and maybe it's useful to bring Thomas Kuhn now also into the conversation, and his interest that actually successive repetitions can introduce significant changes. Successive repetitions of small scale can over time produce significant changes, what he described as a quiet revolution. So I think it's possible to look at each one of these typologies, look at the group of projects in the last 10 or 15 years, and actually see that they are in their own right, in respect to the typology that they work with. You can think of them as a kind of a quiet revolution in the distance they take from, for example, a school today and a school as we knew it, perhaps more generically, as it was first conceived. Of course, another discussion that I mentioned earlier was the relationship between these projects and the market. These projects have, let's say, the last 10 or 15 years has been very much driven by a surge in commissions as a result of obviously the heat in the market, and therefore the demand or the thrust that was put upon architecture to produce, let's call it iconic building, different looking building, for architecture to produce experimental projects. But what is curious, however, is that again, if you look closer, architecture can never compete with the market. Architecture cannot mirror the market, I should say, because as shown by this graph, the market changes by the second, and architecture is far slower. It can never ever mirror the market. It might be initiated the market, but architectural innovation has to find its own speed, if you like, and the two will always be out of sync with each other. And as a result, against this kind of volatile, ever-shortening cycling of the market, we could say that actually the fundamental condition of architecture is always repetition, and that what we do as architects is to devise or design paradigms of repetition within which we produce novelty, within which we produce modification and change and variation in order to innovate. That's what architectural systems allow us to do. Typology being certain functional systems that we have formed at some point and that we continue to evolve them and change them in order to innovate. And this is basically what the form book was trying to document, if you like, looking at the history of architecture and really seeing paradigms of repetition emerging through structural systems. This is how Gothic cathedrals grew over centuries, and this is, for example, how a variety of forms have been developed or could be developed using a diagrid system. It shows, when you look at these, that it couldn't be possibly argued that function produces form, that actually their kind of technical system is the same, but it is those subjective choices, those formal choices that architects have made in each case to produce each one of these forms. And so looking at architecture as a process of differentiation, constant process of differentiation, also in a way brings us to the next subject, which is how, in a way, this form-function relationship involves people, which has historically not been in the equation. We've talked about form and function, but we have not really involved people or the individuals who are supposed to perceive these forms and experience them as part of this equation. So obviously, the minute we recognize that it is architects that produced the innovations and the changes and not the systems by themselves, we also would admit that the expression, the experiences, and even the meanings that generate through forms are somehow the byproduct of architecture. So this is one of the projects that I'm going to show. This is FOA's Cineplex in Leicester. It has an envelope that transmits, it is stainless steel, mirror stainless steel, so it transmits reflectivity, glare, and deformation. Now, there are a couple of points around the building where the passers-by stop and salute the building systematically, no matter what sex they are, what age they are. Something happens between the building and people who look at it. We need to look at this transversal process that happens between forms and how they now function relative to people who perceive them, this transversal process that happens. So we can use Deleuze's distinction between affect and affection, perhaps to diagnose this process. So he says an affection is a feeling, an emotion, or a mood. You could even say thought is a kind of affection, which results as a consequence of a body being affected by the action of another body of form. Say the form would be an architectural form. And so affections obviously are enveloped by the body, and as a result are subject to personal, biographical, social backgrounds of individuals, a kind of a mediation of the person who perceives this action, let's say. So we don't know really what mood, what feeling, what meaning the reflective, the dazzling surface of the cinema has caused in each one of these people. Now, affect, on the other hand, would be an intensity. It would be an intensity that is transmitted by a form or an individual, and its qualities would be dependent on the qualities of that form, the characteristics of that individual or form. So whereas affections are the effect of a form of an individual, affects are pre-personal, they are pre-biographical, they're abstract, and therefore they are perceived by everyone, but not all the time in the same way, because we would process these affects and translate them into different kinds of affection. So these are different snapshots of Yokohama in different areas, and if we could try to name these affects that of course are pre-language, and therefore we will not all agree the same words about them, we could say that in the parking, which is here below, it would transmit affects of openness, axiality, efficiency, and in the terminal, maybe it would be transmitting affect of arching, of pleating, of diagonality. If I could show you another one where you would see the ramps going up, and perhaps on the roof plaza, it would transmit affects of valley, of mountain, of perambulation, of smoothness, etc. So obviously, people interacting with these different areas of the building would obviously generate different kinds of affection, as seen really by their behaviors here, different kinds of feelings, moods, emotions. There are clearly a number of points in Yokohama where you see people having the same reaction. For example, there are a number of points in the building where people sit down and draw. And these are clearly not why the terminal was originally conceived, but it is certainly one of the byproducts of how it is assembled. Maybe a mixture of intimacy, shadiness, results into people wanting to sit down and paint. Let's look at some other examples. None of FOA buildings. We could see that the strong light that flows through the oculus of the Pantheon brings obviously a sensation of centrality into the space, and people gather there. They don't gather in the corners. Conversely, if you look at the Whispering Gallery in New York, as you know, it's a train station. It brings sensations of intimacy, and people go to the corners and literally hug the corners. This is a train station. People are not supposed to be hugging buildings. Now, the external cladding of the Piano New York Times building transmits this sensation of verticality because of the way the external cladding is designed, and so people take part in building. Again, this is not why the building was originally designed. So they obviously, these images show that the way people interact with forms is beyond the form-function equation. It is something as a consequence of the form and function working together. And it also shows that even though the kind of feelings and emotions, the kind of affections that they develop is outside the remit of the architect, that we couldn't have possibly imagined that this would be one of the functions of the New York Times building, but that the affect of these buildings is exclusively the product of the architect. And therefore, I think that what we need to do is to focus on affects, not meanings, when it comes to the discussion of how do we involve or include people or extend people into the equation of the form and function. So it is not, we don't make projects, buildings, build forms meaningful, we make them affective. And what we need to do is to really focus on this power of architecture that through affects is able to be polysemic, have a certain multiplicity to it, like music, like movies. This abstract nature of architecture is actually what makes it more powerful today than ever, given the fact that we are faced with societies that are plural. Working through meanings would be ineffective as a way to connect built forms with people. So on to the kind of the ornament research, which is where it all started. We can revisit the concept of ornament. Ornament has historically occupied this role where there would be a form and a function, and then meanings, symbolic meanings, would be brought to forms through the addition of ornament. Now, perhaps we can now look at this, let's say, rich palette of material that architects work with, play with, assemble to give expression to forms, and recognize that actually great buildings have throughout times produced their own expression, their own ways in which they find their own ways to articulate their relationship with people. And I think that those elements of buildings that do this articulation, do this, let's say, perform this role of connecting people with society, could be called the ornament of those forms. So, you know, the ornament research looked at a group of buildings in the 20th century, looked specifically at their external envelope, and documented how each one of them, you know, meticulously chooses elements, assembles them, articulates them as a way to give them a very unique expression, and as a way to trigger, in each case, a very particular affect or sensation. So, for example, here is an affect of aggregation, an affect of geometricity, an affect of heaviness. This is one of my favorite ones, the Ricola factory by Herzog and de Moran. You know, a factory doesn't really give you, doesn't normally require you to be particularly specific about what it looks like outside. So, and the means are usually very limited. So here they take the same slats that they are cladding the shed with, and they vary the height of the bands, making them smaller at the bottom, and suddenly a shed that could have been freestanding and perhaps not sighted feel heavy and be connected to the ground, have a sense of gravity. Affects of pleating, affects of tonality, this is the Laban Center. And then the form research also tried to expand the discussion of affects beyond the optical and to involve acoustical affects, which of course, because we architects don't really know how to model them, how to visualize them, we don't really have the tools, we are also not so consciously working with them, but of course we know that you can impact the way you feel in terms of sound in a space due to the way a space is formed. And so here, for example, the affect of diffusion would be present acoustically in this form, or diffusion and slowness if you were working with a vaulted system, or diffusion and spectacularity in the case of here a tensile structure. Now, maybe we can look at now a couple of FOA projects a little bit more in detail as a way to unravel the process by which we have tried to deal with that aspect of these forms that are perhaps the kind of expression generating the ornament of these forms, those elements that really produce the kind of the affective nature of them. I'm not going to deal with the projects in their entirety. I'm only going to focus on those elements that generate, articulate the way these projects express themselves. So the department store obviously comes with a whole demand of blankness. Department stores don't want to see out. They want to maximize display area. They want to minimize visual distraction so that everybody is focused on the act of shopping. So the interior, it comes with a whole series of demands like grid sizes and atrium sizes and location of back of house. We are going to park these aside. The question was, how can we, through the design of this project, challenge this blankness of the department store, and how can we connect it to its context? So we thought, well, perhaps we could design this envelope as if it is a net curtain, we can, conceive it as a net curtain that very well is able to obviously let you see out, but not let people see in so much, or at least not during daylight. And we had lots of material to work with, to use as elements to assemble our net curtain. One of them was curtain walls. John Lewis has a building called Peter Jones in London that was the first building that used curtain walls in the UK. That's part of their heritage. They're very, very proud of this building. So we thought we could convince them to use glass, to start with a curtain wall, despite wanting blankness. They specialize in textiles. If you want quality fabrics and textiles, especially at good value, you would run to John Lewis. So textile is part of the context of the project. The site is in Leicester, and Leicester has 200 years of weaving as industry, 300 I should say, and they, despite competition from internationally, they are very interested to keep it. They have a very large population of Indians. They have now their more recent population is more Indian than anything else, and Indians bring into the fabric of the city color. They bring all kinds of patterns, silk-screened patterns, embroidered patterns, painted patterns. So we went to the archive of John Lewis and picked one of, I mean, I'm giving you a very smooth process, obviously. It's not ever as smooth. The truth is that it was a competition, and we instinctively did this, actually, which was trying to find a pattern that gave us a net curtain. And then once we were selected, we went to the John Lewis archive, and we together started with this template on the left, and then tried to evolve it to make it perform in the right way as a department store, let's say, net curtain. So the first thing we did was that, since we knew that it would be produced through a single material, we wanted the two patterns that you see in two colors to be one. We didn't know how we would be producing the pattern, so we thought, well, if we would cut it out of stainless steel, it has to have no breaks. The material has to be continuous. So these were, and you know, their thicknesses had to be kind of managed, etc. It couldn't become too thin. It obviously had to be sufficiently dense enough so that you wouldn't be able to see in. These were some tests of arguing for the fact that obviously the great thing with approaching this with the pattern is that inside you could put up shelves, you know, at full story, partially, or none at all, for departments that could deal with natural light. Now, scale was a material to deal with. You know, what is the scale of this pattern? And through, you know, different tests, we arrived to this, so settled to this scale where at different heights of individuals, from a child to a taller adult, you were to see perfectly through, you know, your head had to see in an uninterrupted way through the pattern. Technical scale, not just visual, was a material to consider. Part L is a regulation in the UK that regulates basically how much U value you gain through skins of buildings, through envelopes of buildings. And so given a glass envelope, we had to have 40% opacity. So this scale had to also mitigate with that 40% dark or the solid areas. Now, privacy was obviously one of the material. We doubled the pattern on 2 layers. And this allowed us to increase the level of privacy, and I'll explain why. When you would be standing on the floor, because the two patterns would line up exactly, you would see out, so like this. And then when you would be looking from the oblique, from the street, obviously the 2 layers would fill each other's gaps, and the pattern would seem a lot more dense than it would otherwise from inside of the floor. So you would see it, let's say, with this kind of density, and the more oblique you would turn towards it, it would become denser and denser. Now, we wanted it to be obviously like a fabric, and we knew that by then we were working with fritting this pattern onto glass, and we were aware that, you know, in the context of looking for opportunities to innovate, that there were already quite a lot of projects using fritting. For example, Herzog de Meuron, Eberswalde Library had used the frit, but it had used the frit as if it would emit a kind of a sensation of a brick, because the pattern would repeat in a serial way. And here we were trying to evoke the idea that this is seamless, this is a fabric, so the pattern had to remove its seams. So we produced 4 templates out of the templates that we had, and each one of these 4s were varying in terms of density internally, but they were meeting their edges. So these edges are, the solid areas are meeting the outline in exactly the same points, which means that you can, you know, mix and match them and never see the seams, even though you're actually regulating how the pattern changes to, for example, correspond to areas where there are service cores, and you want to kind of hide them, etc. Then there is the physical scale that comes in, which is another material that has to be incorporated, because our pattern was more of a visual scale. And of course, glass comes in maximum sizes, and this pattern had to then be again interpreted in terms of how many patterns do you have if you consider your fabrication scale, and therefore we had more of them. Then there is structure to hold this glass fabric, and of course our swirly pattern is trying to remove the presence of any verticals, remove the presence of any kind of orthogonal division of the envelope, and try to evoke that it is in fact fabric. So the structure was not a welcome element, and we had to work to think hard in terms of how you design the glass structure so that you would minimize the presence of the verticals. And the scenario that we ended up with is one where every two pieces of glass are supporting each other, so they are holding each other to one side. There are hangers that you see in these colors that are hanging every piece of glass by one other edge, and at the same time each piece of glass is being restrained by the floor slab. So by the floor slab, the hanger, and the glass all working together, we arrive to the minimum size to the structure, and therefore they appear hardly at all. Then there is the issue of cleaning. Once you have the two layers, because you want to explore more density with the pattern and yet keep your transparency, you have all these catwalks that you need to also manage their visual presence. They bring horizontal lines, and so they had to be, designed in glass. Their edges had to be treated with mirror film. So I'm trying to, in a way, argue how much the technical aspects and the image or the expression are in constant dialogue in order to arrive to, if you like, to the desired sensation, but also how along the way, if one sets up this dialogue between the two, one finds possibilities for even technical innovations. For example, how the structure of the cladding is held up. Then we tried to dig in more into the fritting, and we came accidentally to the idea of the possibility of treating the frit with mirror, which entirely added another dimension to the image, because the pattern suddenly became weightless. Originally, this pattern was a stamp onto the glass, and the minute it became mirror, it would reflect everything onto it. It would become, at least during the day, weightless, and it would also become even denser because of the fact that it would have everything outside of it reflected onto it. Obviously, during the day, the night, when the light would be behind the pattern, suddenly the frit would be almost evoking the idea that it is cast iron, that it is very heavy. So through the assembly of these different elements, all this different material, we get to this double facade where I would say the kind of the mirror frit and the stainless steel and the bolts and the glass and the spanderal panel and the catwalks together become the ornament of this building. And of course they are not part of the core function of the department store, but in fact, they've become absolutely intrinsic to the way you experience the department store, both on the outside and the inside. And on the outside, we experience these different affects of, for example, moire at certain moments, interlacing when the light is behind, arabesquing, for example, when the shadows fill the interior. You could call this tentacular. Layering, where you see, the pattern, you see the fabric of the city through the fabric of the envelope, and neither of them are really seen in isolation. weightlessness and embroidery. Projection at times, when the sun is hitting away from the building, the pattern falls onto adjoining buildings, density, multivalence. This is my favorite image of the project, although it was still under construction, because you can almost not see where the building stops and where the city starts. Where the building starts, if you like, dancing with its context. I think that for me, the interest behind the John Lewis department store, even though you could argue that department stores are one where the architect has less control, because you don't, the inside is formulaic, you don't really, have a say in it, etc. And therefore, just designing the envelope is like architects losing their kind of influence. But I think that I would argue that in this case that's not really at all the case, and in fact that just through the design of this envelope, both John Lewis and as well as this area of the city has found a new way to express itself and a new way to engage with the public. I am going to go quicker. I don't know how long it is. How long have I gone? I'm going to go very quickly through this project and stop. Ravensbourne Colleges is a project that we've finished this year. It played with different materials, again to try to articulate its expression. It's a college. It has different departments. It is by the Dome in London. The Dome, I would say, is really the most important element of this context. Its scale makes it very difficult for any building near it really because normally working with context is about relating to the context, but how do you deal with relating to a context that is impossible to really to engage with? It's so big, it's scaleless. So in a way, the scalelessness became our trajectory of how can we make this building have no scale through the way in which we design it. And there are different kinds of material here that are at play. For example, in an education building, atriums are often used as a way to produce communication across departments. In our case, we stepped the atriums as a way to explore two different views, where the stepped atriums, you would enter into an atrium facing the dome, but as you go up the building, you would gain a different view, a view of the river. Split floors are another, let's say, decision you can make as an architect to explore cross-communication between departments. An interesting history context to the college is that it is rooted in William Morris, so obviously it brings this rich patterns, and we thought, well, actually it's interesting to see how these patterns are in themselves scaleless, and perhaps we could try to develop the external envelope of this building with a pattern that diffuses the presence of the floors, diffuses the presence of the atriums, and makes it as scaleless as possible. So we designed these 3 different tiles that have slightly different shape, and they assemble to produce this pattern. And basically they produce this quasi non-repetitive pattern, and as you keep on tessellating them, they produce openings of different sizes and different shapes, and of course, again, like the Leicester project, scale becomes an important issue, because though we wanted to disguise the scale of the inside, you have to also negotiate with the scale of the floor plates. In other words, you can't have them clash and the floor plates showing through these windows. Structure has to obviously negotiate with this pattern. Then there is all the different programs inside. The college has, the colors are supposed to do without getting into detail. It has lots of different departments. Some of them want light higher up, some of them want light lower down, some of them want no light, some of them want even lighting, some of them want uneven lighting. And so we try to imagine a kind of a template of different situations for an envelope, thinking of each department, in which we would carefully vary with the pattern, the position and size and shape of openings, so that we would produce this dialogue between, if you like, the form of this pattern and the functions inside. And so, you know, you arrive to these areas, for example, where you see that the pattern is varying. With those three same tiles, you manage to cater for these differences within. And as you see here, the envelope is obviously being designed so that this pattern is thought to have a certain microsectional depth that has a certain technical integrity. And this would be like an unfolded envelope with the colors shown and showing how the holes are varying. And of course, then there is again comes how do you fabricate this panel, because our visual pattern that has to do with where you see the openings and where you see out and how big the light is different when somebody comes over and wants to produce this. And we are little tiles. You could never assemble the building putting every single one as an individual tile. We had to panelize it. So we get this situation, maybe a colored version is more easier to understand, that we get these diagonal panels that are consistent with the pattern, that come to site, you know, and get assembled very easily. And the system is so that then the tiles are hooked onto these panels. And so the question was then, again, how do we panelize the tiles that are placed or hooked onto these panels? We went through initially thinking that our panels are made with an opening inside, so we would have this palette, but it ended up actually being, what, 6 of them. Rethinking it, we came to this, in a way, seeing the pattern with different functional criteria in mind, that if you look at actually not the openings themselves, but the solid areas, you find these rosette kind of shapes that in fact allow us to have fewer types, and through just having this range of, maybe this one is easier, of rosettes, we could again assemble the kind of the tiles that finish the envelope with these pieces that again, through the way they kind of aggregate, they would automatically produce the openings. You see them here. And of course there are some odd corners, etc., that give you more. So they come in, you know, in these big panels. And so in a way, what I'm trying to now move on to is that thinking through the image, you can also find ways to innovate in the way you assemble a building. So, you know, this building is not assembled in a kind of a conventional manner. It comes in these pieces. They are very light. They get assembled, you know, diagonally, not vertically. We had to develop a special kind of guide machine that would go along the facade in a kind of a diagonal way and assemble these pieces. Then there is, of course, the joints. And the joints, when you have panelization, the joints can give the game away. You don't want to see the joints in the assembly. So we had obviously our panels behind onto which we would hook the rosettes, and we had the rosettes, and by ensuring that the joints were equal in size in 2 directions, we would basically get the effect that it is, let's say, seamless, or that the envelope is actually assembled by each one of these pieces. We would lose the presence of the larger rosettes in the same way that in the Leicester example, we were losing the glass sizes. And so you get these effects now of non-repetition. and therefore scalelessness against the dome. On the inside, you get this sensation of bubbling. You get variegated porosity in some areas. You get even porosity in other departments. For example, here in one of the classrooms, but perhaps uneven in some of the corner conditions. The atriums don't really show the two views so well, but here you see that one side of the building this is one of the floors of the atriums. It looks to the dome, so you see the profile of the dome. And when you move higher in the building, I think this is the water. You see the water as the other one. So, as ways in which you would use the context, the bringing of the context to the inside through the pattern to also vary the experience of the building. I think I will stop here. Thank you. Sure.
So thank you, Farshid. Maybe there is any question from the audience or comment.
Hello, Farshid. Thank you for a very, very nice lecture. I think it's very refreshing to hear you talk at the beginning of the lecture about what eventually can be perceived as this kind of repetition of styles, you call it, but how it's becoming instrumental for architects. I think it's really important that you say that, because actually I think we are all a little bit, I feel myself very much contaminated by the image of the building, not being able to see beyond the image. And I think it's been very interesting how today you have given us a little bit of a fresh air on the subject. I wanted to ask you, let's say, how do you think that, because you were talking about the innovation that can happen in very little steps by repeating certain paradigms, etc. How do you think that parametric design is, let's say, fundamental tool behind that way of working? If you think there is a limit to it, a little bit to have a kind of insight in relation to that.
I think I have, I must admit that each one of these researchers, like the form, the ornament, and now the style, have come out from things that really trigger a kind of a very negative reaction in myself, right? And that's where you know that there is something that requires looking further, right? So with the form one, it was in fact with the discussion of the parametric. And if you look at really good architecture, it has always been thinking parametrically. It may not have had parametric tools. For example, the Yokohama project, we had no parametric tools. I have a bunch of my friends working on Yokohama sitting here in the audience, and it was done quite manually, but it was thinking parametrically. And you can go much further back than Yokohama, and I mean, that's basically what great architecture is about, thinking about the complexity of the information that we as architects have to play with, right? And great architecture is one that finds a path of least resistance through the greater number of, let's say, material. And my kind of frustration with let's say, what we've managed to do with parametric tools is that, of course, who is going to argue that, with parametric tools you can involve more information, you can explore change, let's say theoretically you can explore change in a much more rapid way. But I am a little bit worried that we either have people who are using parametric tools as a way to deliver projects more efficiently. That's you have to have a very big budget to be able to do that. So there are not many of them. many offices that can do that. So say projects of Frank Gehry do that. Or you have mainly in schools of architecture where we are trying to use parametric tools to explore geometrical complexity mainly. But they are not really thinking parametrically. And I don't think this is because we don't want to. I don't think that the softwares are really for architects. This is my guess. That they don't, that actually, you know, the real space of design is so dynamic and so unexpected in the number of parameters that come in at any one time. It's going to have to be a hell of, you know, a program to be able to allow you to manage that. I tried 1 year to, you know, with my studio to get everybody to do parametric. It was impossible. You know, it was impossible if you didn't want to give up the content. And I am finally much more interested in the content than, you know, investigating the tool. But I think the tools are going to allow us to deal with much more content if we can somehow, you know, I think we are not there yet. I mean, I know that at least at the GST, you know, there is hardly any studio that is doing parametric, and those that are doing it, I would not rate them high in terms of content. You know, they become almost either they become reduced to writing scripts where you'd say ahead of time what you're going to do, and then you write a script to do it. So then what's the point of that tool? Yes, I think that's where they end up.
Following on from that response, what I find interesting in terms of architecture is how the architect can mediate between technology and society. And in terms of the way you present style and decoration, do you think that there is the decoupling of meaning and decoration is now a fait accompli, or is it something that we have to live with and accept, or can decoration and style still have actually a meaning in terms of context, in terms of politics and economics and society?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't use the word decoration. I used the word ornament. You can, of course, you know, twist any one of these words. So this is, you know, I've kind of kept decoration in order to isolate between something that is added and something that is generated. I've kind of kept this difference between ornament as you know, the expression we generate, and decoration as the opposite, which is, you know, which is kind of applied. I don't think that you lose meaning. What I try to explain in the presentation is that, of course, meanings don't go away. I just don't think that architects produce meanings. And therefore, it goes back to the, you know, you can never say form follows function, because no two people are going to perceive the same form and experience it in the same way and develop the same meanings, and therefore, it may be the wish of the architect to be so deterministic of this relationship, but actually the relationship is much more open. And I think what you can be very specific with and control is those affects and sensations that you build into forms. And then it's like a child that you put into this world. You know, you make them, and up to a certain point you kind of control them, and then they go and they become, and I think buildings are like that. You make them, you give them this kind of qualities, and then, you know, people are the ones who generate the meanings, not the architects. So what I'm very interested in is to very much argue for, if you like, the cultural role that forms play, and the fact that they influence people, but in a more indirect way. And so let's not talk about meaning, let's talk about the bits that we do control, and let's try to actually engage in a discussion about them and say, well, you know, maybe certain affects are not are negative in a hospital building. And maybe they might be positive for a kindergarten. You know, and I think unless we start discussing it, it will always remain as a kind of a private discussion of it's so-and-so's way of doing it, you know, so-and-so's style. Did I answer your question?
Any other comment from the Japanese team? Okay, Farshid, thank you very much. Thank you.